Hello and welcome to the Eden Shale Farm. My name is Dan Miller, Farm Superintendent. I have with me today Dr. Steve Higgins with the University of Kentucky, and we're going to highlight some of the projects that we've completed since last year that we do at the open house each year.
When I think about the components of beef cattle production, one of them is basically, in a confinement situation, is managing the manure and also having bedding for these animals. And if you have bedding, then that's also a material that has to be managed from the standpoint of nutrient management or sanitation. What we've done here at the Eden Shale Farm is we have taken one of the pens that would be used for livestock production and converted it into manure storage. So we've basically installed these concrete retaining wall blocks, 2 foot by 2 foot by 6 foot blocks, to basically stack them on top of one another to basically make a 4 foot wall that we can use to contain this manure, and also provide us with a push wall on the back side to push that manure up against to get a load. On this other side was basically a 4 or 5 board plank fence, which was obviously deteriorating with the manure and stuff. And so one of the other applications that I wanted to play around with is basically installing H-beams as posts, as fence posts, and driving those down into the ground, and then using essentially this recycled plastic railroad ties. Some people call them sleepers, which are basically 5.5 inches by about 8.5 inches, which basically just slide down into that H-beam and basically makes a retaining wall for this manure. But the thing about it is this is recycled plastic. It will never, ever degrade from being in contact with manure. If you don't like the cost of it, you could use regular 6x6 treated lumber. And if one of them degraded, you just drop another one in because it's basically being held in by gravity. But it's just an application of again, if you're gonna have animals in confinement, you gotta manage the manure. Hauling at a great distance is not effective, and so having this pen right here adjacent to where the animals are, where this manure and bedding goes, is production efficiency.
So this is our manure stack pad here at the bull barn where we've renovated the floor, and we're going to take a look at that here shortly. But right here is our manure stack pad, and this is a huge upgrade from our previous design, which originally was this was the first pen in the barn. It had the original dirt floor, it had a wood siding over here, and just gate panels over here. So it was not very ideal for storing manure. We were able to get it in under the roof, but you couldn't stack against the walls, and when you came in here to scoop it out, the natural dirt floor obviously got wet and held that moisture, so you churned it up and dug holes and just made a bigger mess as you was emptying this pen. So as part of the renovation, we came in and put the geogrid down, fabric rock and geogrid, to give us a stable surface here inside the barn. We also took the bin blocks and stacked them up, and that really, despite taking up linear width inside the pen, we're able to stack the manure higher, having something to lean against now, and use it as a push wall in the back, so it makes cleaning out the pen much easier. And the grid on the floor is the same way. When we go in here with the skid steer, we can clean it out. It is damp, but we're not going past that grid layer, so it cleans out and functions just like concrete. So very minimal change in here, but a big advantage when it comes to practicality of this manure storage facility.
Okay, so we came to the farm, and this particular barn has got 9 individual pens in it that could have livestock in them. We've converted one of them into manure storage, which leaves us 8 more to essentially play with. And what we wanted to do is basically do a demonstration on different flooring systems that we can install in this barn, do an evaluation of the economics around them, and then how well they held up. So this first pen right here is basically a cinder block floor. There was in the woods, we basically found several thousand cinder blocks, and we took those cinder blocks and we basically installed them with the holes up, and then we backfilled those holes with gravel, and obviously underneath of that is geotextile fabric. We don't do anything out here without geotextile fabric underneath of everything. So essentially, because this was a dirt floor, the cattle and the manure removal, basically, we had a deep depression in this floor of material that had to be made up. So essentially, a cinder block is around 9 inches tall, which is what we needed to make up. So again, put down the filter fabric, put down the cinder blocks, and then filled it up with gravel. The problem or the issue with the cinder blocks is, or maybe it's not a problem, is that cinder blocks are essentially a sponge. They absorb moisture from the atmosphere, and they can basically absorb about a gallon of water per cinder block when you actually consider all the matrix of the rock that's inside of it. This floor right here is basically the plastic grid, which has a geotextile fabric backing on the back of it. I did a pin in that. The next pin is what we call tire cylinders. Tire cylinders are essentially recycled tires where they cut the sidewalls off and you're left with this rubber cylinder that has the tread on it. And so again, we put down geotextile fabric, we lay the cylinder down, and then we backfill that with gravel. So when the animals or load gets on there and you get this deformation of the flooring where basically you have these lateral pressures that are pushing the gravel to the left and the right, that tire cylinder actually prevents that from happening, and it also contains that rock on the inside of it. From the standpoint of wear and tear, that rubber sidewall, which is about 1.5 inches thick, is going to create this ring that the Bobcat blade is going to be able to glide over without digging down into the flooring and removing rock and material out of that. The next floor, we put in what's called a GeoWeb, which is basically an expandable material that you stake out to create holes in it. You backfill those in with rock, and again, that becomes that little thin layer of plastic becomes the final layer. And then I'll let Dan tell you as far as how these floors responded after getting animals on them, animal traffic, as well as cleaning them out.
Well, thank you, Dr. Higgins. Appreciate that. So as you guys see, he's got some pretty unique ideas that we put in the barn here as far as flooring. And wanted to give you an update on how they perform, because last winter we weaned our calves in here, which we do again this year. You see them behind me. We've got about 20 calves in each pen. Last year did the same thing, weaned in the barn, and then we actually did a confinement study here in this barn with our steers from January through March. So right through that wettest time of the year, put them in here on this flooring and fed them in here in total confinement and tested out these flooring options. So we had about 20 steers in here at that time. They went in about 7 weights and came out upper 9. So they were large steers that we had in this facility. So the flooring all performed very good from a standpoint of allowing that moisture to go through. It did a good job. We did bed the pens with straw and would rebed accordingly depending on the weather and so forth. But we could see a big difference that these pens were letting some of that moisture get out. But we did put straw in here, and over the course of 90 days it did build up to a depth of about 18 inches. So we did have a fair amount of bedding in here. Once the steers left, then we let these pens sit because it was too wet for us to haul manure out on the fields at that point in time. So we waited till it dried out a little bit in here so we weren't hauling as much liquid, and came in with a skid steer. We used a Bobcat with a smooth bucket with no teeth on it, and we used one with tracks. And to come in here, the concrete on the outside, obviously we know how it scraped. It scraped very well. When we came in here to the barn, I was very careful at first to make sure it wasn't going to pop up any of these unique options like the blocks and so forth, but soon found out with using the skid steer that precaution was not necessary. You could scrape these just like a concrete floor. You could go just as fast and be just as rough with them, and they held up very, very well. All these applications, there was essentially no difference as far as the moisture content that we saw in them that was left. Everything was pretty much the same. The biggest difference that I will note is the concrete blocks in the first pen here. Dr. Higgins spoke about how they act as a sponge, and what that caused when we scraped them. The pen was not wetter. That moisture had enough time to percolate down and go away, but where those blocks were just a little bit damp, they lost a little bit of their strength in that old concrete. So all of these pens, when I was in here, once I got them clean, during the process, I was kind of rough on them. I did, circles and spun around with the skid steer, trying to abuse them and see how they would hold up. All of them did perfect, other than the blocks that you saw a little bit when you would spin and turn, that those tracks on the skid steer would start to crumble the very top of those blocks that was exposed, where they were a little bit wetter. lost a little bit of their tensile strength, and some of those started to churn up a little bit, and just took a little bit off the top, started making some small fines where that occurred. So if you had them in a spot where you had to make a hard 90-degree turn with a skid steer every pass, over time they would definitely grind down and you'd have to replace them. That was the only difference we saw with these pins from a flooring standpoint that functioned any differently. Was a little bit of extra moisture there, softened the blocks up, but the rest of them functioned very, very well. With the bedding, with our hay structures that we have in the front, we had those steers in here and they gained well and did very good throughout the winter. Here we are at the large bale feeder site. If you were at the Eden Shale open house tour last year, you were able to see this in October. We had finished it and had it here. You'll notice one big difference is we now have a hoop barn structure over it, so it is covered. In all the tours and things that we did, and producers would come up here at the farm and see it, the number one question, the first question every time is, why didn't you cover it? Originally, we would fill this full of hay and we had a large bale tarp, like you would tarp, a pyramid of hay out in a field. We would tarp it and then roll that tarp back as the feeder moved. It was a little bit cumbersome. It'd get rain on it, which was a hassle, but not a problem. But then when that rain would freeze and you had puddles of ice frozen on top of it, it was aggravating. So it worked, but not real well. Last year, we kind of just would put 4 to 8 bales at a time in it and let the cows eat it and replace it so it wouldn't get too much rain and snow on it and do it that way. So we managed it a couple different ways. But ideally, we want to put a roof over it and cover it as we have done now. This allows us, as you can see, we've got 32 roll bales behind me. It's completely full. The strings have been taken off the bales, so it's ready to eat, it's ready to feed right now. So the hay that's in here, these 32 bales, this summer we baled the hay out of the hay field nearby, brought it straight into this barn, stacked it, took the strings off, and we don't touch it again. It's ready to feed. This building will function both as a storage facility and as a feeding facility. So our 32 roll bales are in here. Cows can come from the backside, can eat this hay, work through it. That feeder will slowly work its way back. And then if we get done and we need to refill it, we just push it back, put 32 more roll bales in there, and the cattle have access. So the roof we added this year, which is going to allow us to use this barn much more efficiently. Like I said, last year we used 4 to 8 bales at a time. Now we can fill it full of the 32. We don't have to worry about hay waste, so we know it's going to be more efficient from that standpoint. Are the cattle going to loaf in it more? I expect yes. They now have food under cover, so they probably will loaf a little bit more and cause a little bit more mess on the concrete. But their waste and their mess they created before was almost non-existent, so I still don't think it's going to be significant enough that it's going to cause us a problem. So very excited to use this structure as Dr. Higgins originally intended it and designed it in his head and had. We have this facility which we'll put part of our cows on in the winter and then be able to rotate them accordingly up through calving season. So this will serve as a big part of our winter feeding operation right there in the toughest time, January through February time frame. The cows will be on this facility, the large bale feeder.
This is a 27-acre hayfield right here. This is a Bar Optima grass that we have here. Really nice. We're getting ready for hay season, so this is getting ready to be cut. When this is cut, then basically it has to be moved. Typically this will go to a storage structure. On some farms it gets stored outside, which is basically going to make it lose some nutritional value and do some rotting, which means that animals will refuse it. There's a barn right here in the center, or very, very close to the center of this particular hayfield. And so I could ask you, what is the purpose of a barn on the farm? And most people will sit there and think, and they'll basically say shelter. And that's a pretty good answer, but it all depends on your perspective. To me, in perspective, the barn or a structure is supposed to serve the landscape or serve the farm. So what does that mean? Well, if I got a hay field right here, what we're going to do is, just for the simplicity standpoint, when we harvest this, now we got it, you know, peppered with basically roll bales, those will have to get moved to a storage structure. Later on, those will get moved to, again, to do basically the winter feeding. So what you're doing is you're loading and unloading and you're moving, and you're, in my opinion, you're wasting a lot of time, okay? So what this is about is simplicity, all right, and also land planning. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this hay from this hay field, and we're going to move it one time, and we're going to put it in this barn that's adjacent to this hay field, and it's going to be stored there, and then we're done, okay? So when it comes for winter feeding time, what's going to happen is the cattle are going to approach the back side of the barn, which is the southern side. We've created these little lots with about 300 feet of fence, so the animals will be over here. This is a 27-acre hay field, but we're going to cleave off about 1.5 acres, so we'll still have 26 acres of really good hay. We're just losing 1.5 acres over here where we're going to have the cattle. So they're going to come in on this back approach, and they're going to start eating that hay. And as they start eating that hay, this feed barrier that I have installed in the alleyway of this barn is on rails, and so it will just slide back. So there's 30 some odd bales in here that we're going to store in here will never get moved again, and the animals will basically self-feed themselves, okay? Now, if we have to reload this because we didn't have enough hay for basically the stocking density that we have, we'll go get some more hay and we'll reload this magazine. But in doing that, we'll never have to open a gate. We just basically load it in this end and they'll start over again. So to me, what we've done is we've eliminated jobs of opening gates and driving. In a farming operation, particularly livestock, what you want to do is create efficiency. And what you need to overcome is distance. These barns provide the capacity to overcome distance. Okay, so here we are looking at this barn again, and this is going to be the cattle side. We've created this little lot basically for the cattle, and by creating this little lot, what we've now created is access to this field or pasture that's over here, and also access to this field and pasture that's over here. So that's good. So this thing's basically connecting the two and interfacing them, which is good. That's what you want. It creates better access and location. We'll end up doing a heavy traffic pad right here out of geotextile fabric and rock. The beauty of this is the barn already had a concrete floor. If it's got a concrete floor, why don't you use it? And so basically what we're using is the existing columns of the barn and basically mounting this track on here so that this thing will basically work like this. So the hay will be on the other side, the cattle will put their head through here, and then basically we got a barrier on the back side to reduce waste, and then it basically just slides back. Now, the thing is people might be like, well, why did you spend all this money on this? And my thing is we could have used hay feeders or hay rings, which are used on this farm. And hay rings, in my opinion, are basically an asset and a liability. From the asset side, you can put a hay ring anywhere. You can easily move it. You can have a feeding site in just about any place you want. But on this farm and other farms that I work on, a feeding site will be there and has been there for generations. And so even though a portable structure like a hay ring works really, really well, I don't believe we should do our long-range planning based on a portable structure. This is a fixed structure, and by being a fixed structure, what it can do is make a contribution to the farming operation since it's already here. I'm not asking you to build a new barn. This is the renovation of an old barn to basically make it more useful. Okay, so let me do a clarification on feed barrier design and capacity, because it also has a lot to do with dimensions and stuff like that. I probably have about a 20-inch opening right here for a cow to stick their head through, which is plenty. 14 is a pretty good size. Got a throat barrier right there, which is good. What really helps this out from the standpoint of reducing waste is this side right here, because the animals are going to be on the other side, okay? And they're going to have to stick their head through, which means the bales are going to be right here. So they have to stick their head through to get to the bale, which means that reduces waste. What they'll do is they'll cleave a lot of that off, and that's going to hit down the bottom, and then they'll eat that stuff off the bottom, and there's be very, very little waste here, okay? Also, when we put these roll bales in, we will take all the strings off. All right? When we harvest it and put it in here, strings come off, and it's done. So a lot of people are going to look at this and basically say, well, this can only serve like 6 animals at a time. Well, that's true, but this is hay, and it's going to be here free choice, 24/7, which means what I can do is take that 6 animals or 7 animals that could eat here and multiply that times 3. And what I get is I can feed 20 animals or 25 animals in a herd with this one structure, because it's free choice feed and it's here and available all the time. So that's an important design feature to remember about this. If it was concentrated diets, then yeah, I would need 2 linear feet for each animal. But being here, free choice, I don't need as much space for them. On this farm, we fed 352 bales of hay last year. Typically, we're feeding 2 bales at a time. This will feed 30. To me, that's efficiency.
So we're here at the Barn Alley Feeder, and I'm excited for this project because this is one that is very practical. We can take any of these old tobacco barns and recreate this here in Kentucky. And for us, it's going to allow us to spread out our cattle during that January, February time frame. So before we calve, we're just feeding them hay. I've got this structure now in addition to the large bale feeder up there, where historically that's where I have my cattle all together, and would use that structure. Now I can break the herd into 2 groups and use this structure for part of them and that structure up there for part of them. So that'll allow us to be more efficient with the utilization of these structures and to make sure that the management of the cows during that time is being done so accordingly. This structure works very good from a standpoint. We've not fed out of it yet, but we harvested the hay. There's a hay field right here just adjacent to me. We harvested the hay there and put it directly in this barn. So it was a very efficient process. It was a much shorter travel time than taking them all the way back to the hoop barn. And just like the large bale feeder, we came in here, took the strings off and stacked the bales in here. As you can see, we've got the bales stacked too high. We had, because the existing width of this barn, which all barns are going to vary, but our existing width, 2 bales at the bottom didn't touch, so we had a gap there. So we put the 3rd bale there in the middle. It kind of sank down into that gap, which ultimately lowered the height of having it stacked too high. So we think that's going to work with this design, this feeder design, but that's something we're going to test this winter. Whereas the large bale feeder, we've only used 1 high up there because of the way that's designed. 2 bales doesn't work. But just because the width of this barn, the way it worked out, we are going to try the hay stacked too high to give us a little bit more capacity. This barn behind me, stacked the way it is, will hold 30 bales. So it gives us very good capacity, very similar to the other feeder, to break those cows up, put them on these 2 different self feeders throughout the winter time, and use that to feed hay during the coldest and wettest parts of the winter.
Okay, we're going to talk about farm ponds and livestock. This is the Eden Shale farm, and there are 6 farm ponds on this property, and at one time or another we have tried to develop one of them for livestock purposes. Yes, so there's tons of farm ponds across the landscape of Kentucky. Many beef cattle producers let their animals have full access to a pond. In my opinion, that's a bad plan. It's going to mess up water quality as far as them urinating and defecating and then turning right around and then drinking it up. So that's going to affect animal health for sure. In addition, when they have access to it, they're going to do a lot of sloughing of the banks, and you're going to displace that water volume with basically eroded soil, which means now it has to get dredged out. That's also not a good plan. What I prefer is basically this. This pond is being excluded. It has full exclusion. No cattle will have access to it. You can see the fences that run around this pond. We have a ton of buffer space around that pond, which is needed to filter out that runoff water before it gets to that pond, so that we're storing clean water for that livestock. Once you get that water in that pond, you need to distribute it out of it. In this case, we're using gravity, which again is free energy. We're using gravity to basically supply and distribute this water downhill for these animals to drink away from this pond. Another option would be to install electricity in the form of a solar panel, or if that is necessary, to pump that water uphill. There's other devices that can be used so that animals do not have full access to a water body. There's nose pumps, there's other pumps that you can put, or devices that you can put off to the side, so that those animals do not have access to the pond. But this is a real good example of how it works. Water in the pond, buffer area, full exclusion, gravity fed down to below a tank down below that also has access to several different pastures.
So the pond development here at Eden Shale Farm, this is on the Eden Shale map, it's field 45. And if you look at it from an aerial, this field is shaped like a horseshoe. And this pond is at the very bottom of the horseshoe. So it wraps around both sides, and it's about a 25-acre field in total. So this, for us, of the multiple farm ponds we have, this one made the most sense to break up and to develop. So what we did, as Dr. Higgins said, we put the tire down below, and we're using gravity to get the water from the pond down into the tire. And you can see that tire position down there below the pond dam. Fence the cattle out of the pond completely, so that's complete vegetation now. And the field, if you go down below the dam here, this fence goes down alongside the woods on this side all the way down to the far side of the field. So that gives us creates the western half of this pasture. The woods is our shade and water right here in the middle, and then the other side of the woods we have another fence. It does the same thing, goes from the top of the field to the bottom of the field. It's the narrow part of the field and creates the east part of the pasture. So we've taken a 25-acre field and broken it up roughly into two 12-acre pastures. So that allows us to increase our efficiency when it comes to our forage management and our grazability of our grasses. And it allows us to increase the longevity of the service of this pond. This pond is in great shape. It holds water all year long. It's fairly deep, so it has pretty good quality. But we wanted to keep those cattle out of it, like Dr. Higgins said, and preserve that so that we can use this for a long time to come. This is also one of the last fields that we typically graze stockpiled fescue on. So there is a chance of having cold weather, and we've had ice on that pond before, and ice on ponds and cattle, it just does not mix. So we want to keep those cattle off there, keep them a thawed water source down there in that tire that'll help us, again, utilize the forages in this pasture and increase our efficiency of management around the forages for these cattle at all times of the year.